Hey everybody, we're back from our break. As you can see, it's a new day. Sometimes you got to do this in parts. Like I said, at any point in time, if you need a break with this, walk away, do a stretch, stop the video, and we will continue on. What I'm going to do right now is to continue to screen share our PowerPoint, and we'll talk some more. So when we look at this, in terms of the types of services that students need, we talk about wraparound services, situations in which school, community, mental health, other services are really wrapped around the student. And you're looking at types of things in terms of an initial plan development and what that takes, the kind of team that we put together for each of these students, and the engagement that they have with each other in order to prepare those plans. The implementation of the plans for the best interest of the student, and then how do we then also transition all of that support as we go forward and either change the way those services are provided as the student continues to grow and develop. One of the things that you really need to think about with wraparound services are outlined here. And the key things I believe that we need to consider is that we give the student voice and choice. It is team-based, so it's not just the professional, it's the parent or guardian, it's the student. What do those supports look like in terms of the environment that we are giving them in? Are they something that can't be sustained because they're too difficult, too expensive, or not really realistic? That's what sort of we talk about natural supports. The collaboration between the team members is really important, as well as the fact that you want to look at the cultural competency. In other words, how does the culture of that student inform all of the decisions that we are making? These plans are always individualized, and they're based on the student's strengths. We've talked a lot this semester about how we look at students with disabilities, not from what they cannot do, from the perspective of what they can do. And that's a strengths-based service plan. The persistence of the student, of the challenges that they're having, and really what the outcomes are. How do we create positive outcomes for students? So when we look at determining different types of services and aids, you want to look at these operational components. And one of the things that, again, we look at wanting to do is to make sure that that student is integrated with various and sundry peers. In looking at the evidence-based support of class-wide peer tutoring, if you look at these components, they are very UDL, if you want to talk about it. It's using some sort of multimodal learning, reciprocal and distributive practice. In other words, where the person, the student, is serving as both the learner and the teacher. How do we create immediate feedback situations for error correction? And how do we engage in, for lack of a better word, effortless learning? We want to be able to make sure that the anxiety and the frustration that many of our students with all types of learning disabilities have, Those things are lessened because, again, students who have emotional or behavioral disorders, one of their main triggers, more than likely, is frustration. How do we create interactive games or ways to motivate students? Again, this is really about creating situations where learning becomes fun. And games and competitive team kind of things involve an interaction that really happens in the real world. It creates motivating material and also the basis for creating teamwork. These have built-in reinforcements. How do we create those? High mastery levels. In other words, we're working on content-specific goals to the capacity of each student, and we have to have measurable outcomes, as with all of our students. So when we look at universal design for learning, again, technology can really do a lot to support students who have a difficult time regulating their own behaviors. Word processing software reduces frustration. It increases a student's willingness to, for example, edit or correct their work, which results in really, as you know, clean and legible product instead of belaboring through something that may be handwritten. Applications on tablets also make tracking and progress monitoring a lot easier. The other piece, again, planning for other needs, is that when we talked in the previous lecture about how half of the students drop out of high school, what do we need to create positive outcomes? Because when you look at dropout rates, you then also look at low employment rates for dropouts. And there are lots of reasons for that. So we have to look at different types of interventions that reduce dropout rate. It's about engagement. It's about how do we keep these students engaged and motivated. Errorless learning, in other words, going back to the concept of these are the expectations for the student, but how do we scaffold the fact that they can go through math problems relatively seamlessly and understand their own outcomes? Creating positive social and interpersonal atmospheres. Our classrooms need to be an open and safe place for all students, but especially students who struggle with the interpersonal skills that really impede their transitioning into adulthood. How do you do and create check and connect strategies? In other words, to check in with the student, to connect with them, to be that significant other in their life. If they don't have a parent who does so, who says, I believe in you, this is where we are, this is how I stay connected with you, and this is how we can focus on you being successful. We want to try and provide vocational training and education. In other words, not everyone is headed for academic success in college, but we can create opportunities for students who shine in other ways, in vocational training and job training, for them to go forward and be productive. We also have to provide ongoing emotional support, in some respects, as we try and do with all of our students, but especially these students. So we've looked at, I'm going to move this down a little bit. We've looked at the different ways of using universal design for learning. So let's say we're looking at a Common Core standard in reading. If you look at this graph, on the far left-hand side, the standard for reading, for literature, this is a grade 7 standard, says analyze how an author develops and contrasts the points of view of the different characters or narrators in the text. What I want you to do right now is stop and look at that standard and write down what the main verb is. What do we want that student to do? If your answer is analyze, yay! We want the student to be able to analyze an author's points of view of different characters in a text. So how do we create multiple ways for that student to be able to understand that if, let's say, the student isn't necessarily a grade level reader, right? We do have, if you look at the multiple representation column, we do have text-based materials. That can be challenging for many of our students. So how do we shift that representation and give them additional information about how an author develops and contrasts points of view? We could do it via a graphic organizer. We could do it via pictures. We could do it via storyboards that we present in class on how the different points of view develop. Representing material that is understandable along multiple access points. That's what multiple representation is. This middle column, which is multiple engagements, it provides different ways, again, for that student, all the students in the class, to be able to engage with the material that you're presenting. And if you read through this column, again, pause the lecture, and look at all of the different ways that we can do that, especially when you go down to the very bottom. And how is it that the application to real life, where people have different points of view, that becomes very relevant. You can connect that to students' background knowledge. So how can you, in this wanting the student to be able to show you how to analyze, connecting information, again, through debates or discussions, drawing pictures, etc. Assessment, again, that term tells me as the teacher, how do I know that the student understands the material and can present it in a way that allows me to provide a way that I can grade them, that I can see if they've mastered what I'm asking them to understand. Again, to provide multiple ways, depending on the student, depending on the student's ability. If you look at that standard at the far left, nowhere in that standard does it state that something has to be written. It does not have to be a written product. So it provides the opportunity for we as educators to individualize based on what we know our needs of our students are, to be able to tell us what they know. All right? So that's this type of graph for you to look at. If you see a Common Core standard, again, part of what looking at developing lessons are is what is that standard asking us as teachers to create for clear understanding. I think I'm going to move my little box down here again. I'm going to let you look at this. And what I will do is I will create something in the next couple of weeks so we can actually play around with this idea a little bit more. But this is, again, this is the same idea of how do we take a math standard. This is a grade 7 standard about probability, and create the multiple means of representation, the multiple means of engagement, and the multiple means of assessment. So aside from, the various things that we've talked about, there are other evidence-based strategies, and your book goes through several of them. I will talk to these and find some resources for you to look at in terms of Powtree, some self-monitoring, as well as I had spoken earlier in the previous video about social skills training. So if I look at classroom style intervention with early childhood, these are the kinds of instructional strategies that we're talking about. Classroom type centered, partnering with families in terms of interventions, and then different ways that we can engage students in learning strategies in order to be successful, especially at a young age. You're looking at social stories. I'm going to pause right now. I will come back to you in a moment. Okay, one of the effective instructional strategies that we look at for students like this, especially again when you talk about their social and emotional well-being, is that we create teaching activities within the realm of community service. It is designed to teach civil responsibility. In other words, what it means to be in a larger context of real life. And going out into the communities. With secondary and transition, and again, I think that this is actually something that we should talk about in terms of even very young children, but it's about conflict resolution and how students need to learn how to be effective communicators, deal with anger management, taking others' perspectives. Again, conflicts always happen. We as adults deal with conflict every day on many different levels. But these students especially need to be taught directly how to problem solve in order to make successful decisions to mitigate these kind of situations that will come up in their lives. This is 10-year-old data, but I think more and more we look at the educational placement in terms of many of these students. There's still less than 50% of these students have the bulk of their day within a regular classroom. Other settings could be therapeutic schools. Separate schools could be what's considered non-public schools, and there are many here in the Los Angeles area that specialize in working with students in much more of a wraparound setting in order for them to be successful. So talking about mastery, uh, what we do is that instead of assigning um, A, B, C, D percentage type of things, mastery learning is frequently used to assess how well students master content. In other words, do you really have to do 100 math problems to be successful in knowing how to do double-digit addition? Social skills, again, is something that we need to really look at, and there are lots of different programs that deal with social skills training. And we will continue to offer possibilities. One of the older, meaning from the 1990s and early 2000s, authors is a gentleman named Rick Lavoie. And he talks a lot about social skills and what he calls social autopsies. When students have difficulty in interactions or something going on, it is a way for us as teachers to be able to then step into a situation with some sense of immediacy and say, let's look at what just happened and why, and what are the next steps that could have been made in order to maybe mitigate an issue that escalated into something larger. We have to also consider making test accommodations, and you will see a lot about that when you read different kinds of IEPs as you go forward, but many times what you're looking at is test anxiety, and that heightens the sense of not being able to be successful. Anxiety, is, we all know, creates its own weather, so to speak, and so test accommodations may be things like extended time periods, individual test administration, in other words, away from a group in a quieter area, much more frequent breaks. So again, these are the types of accommodations that we make because we do assessment on a fairly frequent basis in our academic settings. Rita Pearson is an educator, and you'll find this link on Blackboard. She speaks from the heart in this TED Talk about the student-teacher relationship. And I have made it optional, but I really hope that you take the time, if you have not seen this, to really look at it. And it makes me feel very reflective as a teacher to think about how we can create positive interactions for every student that we come in contact with. But this is especially pertinent for us as teachers when we have students with emotional and behavioral disorders. Restorative justice in special education is a very important, noteworthy topic. It's not only in a special education realm, but it's also about how the practice of restorative justice school-wide and how we resolve conflicts to promote equity across the board, as well as with students with special education, is prominent in our forethought. Something that is been evident through research and statistics, very much so, is the fact that we have an overrepresentation in our special education population of children of color in this particular category. And I think there's a need for us to look at going back to what the stress responses are in humans. So go back to Nadine Burke and the ACEs study. What our stress responses are and how we need to really look at how we're teaching resilience for trauma and everyday crises for our students. So you do have 2 links that you will be able to access on these practices in this week's Blackboard folder. So some good news. Next week is spring break. Right now, the week of the 6th and the 23rd, we're having classes online. I don't know why I did the 16th. Through the 23rd, we're going to have classes online. And stay connected with the CSUDH community for the policies as we go forward because of what's going on currently right now. And I'm speaking to you, today's date is actually March 19th. Everything keeps changing. Make sure that you review some of the upcoming assignments, and we will have further notice on what the decision is in regards to field-based observations. It looks like we don't know for sure that schools may be closed, childcare may be closed through the end of this semester. So again, I encourage you to keep up with what the university policy is. You have my text number. Make sure that you include your name as well as the class that you're in, because I have about 100 students this semester. You can send me an email, and you have my email. And I will be more than happy at any point in time to set up a Zoom meeting with you or a phone meeting with you. We have so many other things that are going on in our lives other than just our coursework. And I appreciate your engagement in this change of platforms. So again, I will be trying to send you updates. We will continue to play in this realm, and it's all good. So that's kind of where we are right now. I'm going to stop share. You're going to see me full screen. And again, please make sure that you contact me if you have any kind of question, concern. The syllabus at this point is a bit fluid in terms of some of the assignments, and I will have further details on assignments either via a video chat, an email, or some other mode of communication. So have a great week. Again, spring break starts the 30th. I'm sure that all of you have lots of things that are going on, but in this time of anxiety and change, be well and be safe, and practice social distancing, practice good hygiene, practice keeping calm, not only for yourselves, but for all of us around. So take care.